All right, well, welcome to episode number 36 of the Oklahoma Weather Show. Here we are now, basically just rolling out of the summer season, now into the fall season. Our weather is changing a lot, not only right here in Oklahoma, but all over the United States. And of course, one of the biggest impacts that we look this time of the year is frost, freeze, all sorts of damaging weather, and what it means to the agriculture community. I know that certainly a lot of things that we do every single day come from the ag community, but sometimes we take it for granted. So we wanted to focus this show today on the agriculture community, what they are doing right now, what they have done in the past, and what they're going to be doing in the future, and how the weather plays a huge role in that. So our special guest today is Angie Maguire. She is the Vice President of Grain for Citizens. She is all the way up in Michigan. So Angie, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Kind of tell us a lot about yourself and how you got to being where you are now.
Well, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Like you said, I'm the Vice President of Grain for Citizens Elevator up in Michigan. So I'm in the south central part of Michigan, south of Lansing. I can hold up my hand and show you I'm like right here. So I have the luxury of still doing that. I can't ever move out of the state. But I run an elevator here. So I do all of the buying and the selling, work direct with the farmers, do all of that good stuff and work with the markets and see where we're going, work with farmers. And here we have about 5 locations, handle about 12 million bushel annually, and work with farmers all over the state and all over the country now. So that's my gig.
So what exactly is happening right now in the ag community? What are the farmers and everyone either doing right now or preparing to do?
Preparing for harvest if they're not harvesting. A lot of guys now we've hit the point where stuff's starting to run. So they are out. I think in Oklahoma they say picking corn. Up here we say run corn. So it depends on where you're at on what you're doing. But harvest is going to get going. To the south it's going a lot heavier than what it is up here. So for the most part that's what everyone's getting ready for, is we're kind of wrapping up the old and getting ready to bring in the new.
Has it been a good year?
Weather-wise, it's been pretty good. Depending on what you say, for the bulk of places south of where we're at, it's been decent. They've been quite a bit warmer. Where north of into Michigan, Minnesota, the Dakotas, places like that, it's been cooler. I mean, for us, we went back to basically looking at 2009 weather is what it was, where it never, I think we had maybe one 90-degree day up here, and actually beans and corn like a little bit of warmth, and we've just been missing it. Like I said off air, this is the best stretch of weather I think we've had all summer, and unfortunately yesterday was the first day of fall. So it's been good weather-wise, but some areas it hasn't been as good as what folks would like you to believe, just because it's been a little too cold.
How has, this has been a very weird year. If you look back to what we had back in the wintertime with these big Arctic outbreaks, I know up there in Michigan, it was incredibly cold. It was very cold here in Oklahoma as well. There were many days where we never got above freezing, which is a big deal for being this far south for us. I know the wintertime, there's always that preparedness that you're getting ready to go into the spring and the summer season. Were farmers at all on, I guess, a little uneasy, wondering how was the cold from this past winter going to impact them at all for the summer, or do they just keep looking forward and never look back?
No, they were worried. There was record-setting ice on most of the lakes. I mean, I think most of the lakes were covered. So there was this idea that we were going to go into the season a heck of a lot colder than what we were used to, due to the fact that we had the ice around here. Spring was really slow, really wet early on, so the spring wasn't that great for us by any means. And then once it turned, it never really turned all the way. I mean, we went from kind of chilly and wet to not as chilly and wet to it dried out for a bit. But the one constant that we've had this year so far is it seems like every time we turn around there's a rain or there's something that has happened. And now we're hitting harvest time. We kind of like it to warm up and dry out like it is, but for the most part, we knew coming into this year that it was probably going to be colder than what we wanted it to be.
I've noticed a lot of times, to me, working in the community and that you do, it's got to be very stressful. because you rely so much on the weather, and it's really the one thing that we can't control at all. I mean,
Yeah.
you can talk to farmers, and they kind of say, oh, we're going to wait another week until the last freeze to do whatever we have to do, but this has been such a weird year. You compare that to what we had, especially out here in the plains back in 2011 and 2010, and even 2012 when we had this ongoing drought, and we still have this drought going on in western and southwestern Oklahoma. How, if you are a farmer and you are dealing with a drought, what can you do to try to at least keep yourself above water, or is there no way getting around it?
Well, there's ways to get around it. We have seen genetics play a role where there are certain types of corn that you can plant and other things that are made specifically to deal with dry conditions, hot and dry weather. That's really been the focus of the side of the corn market, has been how do we better handle drought? Are we able to grow in areas that don't have the significant rainfall that we're used to and things like that? So, excuse me, that's been a steady push. We've seen that. We've seen an increase in irrigation. We've seen an increase in just being aware of how we're planting, what we're planting, conservation strategies, things like that. So there have been ways, that guys have looked into, like specifically the Panhandle in Oklahoma. I have friends down there that are planting, they call it Super Milo sorghum, that's made specifically to handle drought, and it's done real well this summer.
How have they recovered at all, or has the farming community recovered from the drought and the intense heat that we had back in 2011? I remember looking up in the Corn Belt during that time of the year, and really from a weather standpoint, and what even the media down here was concentrating on a lot was, where is the rain in relation to the Corn Belt? Mm-hmm. And and it would be at least a weekly or a bi-weekly story that we would do. So did they recover, or are they still hurting from that drought even a couple years ago?
Most of the places have recovered from a soil moisture standpoint. We've seen a recovery in subsoil and topsoil moisture throughout the bulk of the belt. We do see some reoccurring abnormally dryness, every now and again pop up and things like that. Some farmers that struggled, let's say they had a reduction in production and issues of that nature, and perhaps a reduction in revenue, they're still trying to recover, but from an overall crop conditions standpoint, the recovery has been pretty good throughout the bulk of the belt. It's the southern plains and areas like that where you guys have been struggling, where we've seen the slow recovery happen, if there is one.
Yeah. Would you say right now that food is cheap compared to where it could be in the future?
The hard part with food being cheap, or where it could be in the future, is there's a whole lot that goes into food costs that we don't necessarily pay attention to. A lot of folks have went through the ethanol argument, where ethanol made corn go up, and of course that made everything else go up. No one really discussed the fact that $5 a gallon diesel fuel had made transportation costs increase exponentially during that same point in time. And we've also seen the price of corn fall by nearly a third, where soybeans have also dropped pretty significantly. Fuel costs have dropped significantly, and we still haven't seen a big reduction in food costs. So I don't think we will. We always joke in the industry that freight costs, once they go up, they're never coming back down. And that's the big thing, is do you call a trucker and say, okay, well, you used to haul this for this. The price of diesel's gone down. We're going to go ahead and reduce that rate. You're going to have some pretty angry folks on coming up against you. So from a food cost perspective, with the grains outlook and things like that, I do think that we should see a back off in some transportation costs, which could help. But from an overall standpoint, I don't know if you'll see them cheapen up a whole lot, and I hope they don't get too much more expensive. But as we feed more people, as we get to where we're feeding 7 billion and then 8 billion and 9 billion, and we see the overall global demand change, you're looking at Chinese, that there's estimates that Chinese beef demand could increase by another 70% between now and 2030. So you're looking at a 16-year, almost double increase in what the Chinese people are asking for when it comes to their protein source. So it's not necessarily the farmer who's to blame for high food costs, or even for high transportation costs. It's just globally we want a better diet, so you have more competition for who we're feeding and how we're feeding them.
We did a couple weeks ago. We had a gentleman on our show, and he was talking a lot about water, and how water is so scarce, especially in this part of the United States. And of course, the ag community needs water to kind of get things going when Mother Nature won't produce it. How have you heard any talk amongst farmers and where you are, even out here in this part of the United States, where they say, you know what, we're hurting and we can't get water in here? Or is it one of those Mother Nature always seems to eventually come back around and drop just enough rain when we need it most?
Nah, there are going to be areas that hurt. I'm spoiled. I'm from Michigan, so I've been out. We're surrounded by water. We actually try to get rid of water. Like they pull water off from fields here. We tile and all of that. But like I said, I've got friends and the Panhandle's been. There's certain spots in the Panhandle you see are still in extreme drought. Parts of western Kansas, things like that. Parts of Nebraska. There are going to be times where we see water restrictions come in, and they're future-wise, it's all going to be Mother Nature. We can hope. I mean, it seems as though everything's cyclical, so we have a drought like 2012, and then we recover, and you see things kind of rebuild a little bit. We hope that continues, but, I mean, you'd be foolish to think that there won't come a point in time someday where we are discussing water usage and who's using what and where. Now, I can tell you that the bulk of my farmers are very aware of conservation practices when it comes to water use. The majority of them. I'm not going to say there isn't the unusual guy that's irrigating beans that are ready to be harvested in 2 or 3 days for no apparent reason. But for the most part, a lot of my farmers that I work with nationwide are working with water conservation groups and being aware of what's going on from that perspective to make sure that they have enough water down the road to feed the 7, 8, 9 billion people that we're going to have to feed here eventually.
One of the shows that I like to listen to a lot when I'm driving home is I'll listen to Ag PH radio on Sirius, and of course the conversations that they talk about are way over the head of someone who does not work in the agriculture community. So one day they're talking about nitrogen, another day they're talking about pesticides, and then another day and it goes all over, and they have these callers that come in. For the average person that is driving down the road right now that does not work or even know anyone that works in the agriculture community, try to explain to that person what the farming community is doing right now, what they will be doing next month, and so on.
They are working on, basically trying to figure out a way to do as much as they can possible with as little as possible. So what they're trying to figure out and what the farmer's trying to do is, not only how can he avoid increasing his costs on the input side, but also how he can produce more with less. The bulk of the farmers out there, you'll get a lot of feedback of nitrogen leaching and just things like that where there's some big concern. And there is concern out there, but I can tell you, I can guarantee you that the farmer is not going to give up those inputs easily. So he's going to do everything he can to avoid that flowing out of the field and into something else. So, like I said, again, the bulk of farmers, there are the occasional farmer out there that, the bad apple in the barrel, but for the most part, every farmer that I work with is trying to figure out ways that he can reduce his inputs, reduce the fertilizer that he's using, be more aware of how he can make his soil more fertile. There's so much out there with precision planting where they're counting the amount of seed they put in per acre to make sure that they're maximizing growth and making sure that the seeds aren't competing. If you have too many corn plants in an area, they're competing for resources, things like that. So there's just this whole level of farming that a lot of people don't see. I joke it's like an onion. And the population sees the outside of the onion, and what they don't realize is that there's 10, 15 layers that go into this onion, and the bulk of guys that I work with, their biggest asset is their land. So the last thing they're going to do is do anything to hurt the land that they have, and so a lot of guys are learning, like I said, how to do more with less now. Almost the typical conservation side of things that I think most folks are seeing, and we get a lot of guys in now that are our generation. So they grew up in the 80s where you cut the pop can holder to make sure it doesn't get caught on a bird's neck. And we went through the whole entire conservation side, shut your water off and brushing your teeth. And And so a lot of these guys are bringing that into the agriculture side of things.
We do a lot of our shopping, my wife and I. We like to go to the farmers market, and we like to get the produce that is local. But of course, you drive down through Oklahoma, and a lot of these towns have these big box stores. You have Walmart, you have Super Walmart, you have your Walmart neighborhood market. Do farmers like going to Walmart, or is Walmart the devil?
They like going to Walmart for the most part. I mean, Walmart we have a Meyer up here is what it is. It's like Super Walmart. It's great, but they work a lot with local farmers. I was on the Pro Farmer Crop Tour here in August, where we traveled across the country to see what was out there. And Walmart actually sent several representatives so they could be on the ground floor working, talking to farmers, seeing what was going on out there and things like that. So yeah, Walmart, from a wholesale perspective, they're going to try to buy everything they can as cheap as possible. So not everyone's going to be excited about that. But when it comes down to it, they've opened up resources or a customer base that we may not have had otherwise. So I think it's kind of one of those, I don't even want to say a love-hate relationship, because there really isn't much in the way of hate aside from the mom and pop establishments that may get squeezed out eventually. They're viewed as a customer and as a distributor of food and produce, and I think they're a good thing for ag as long as they keep a good mindset about them as we move ahead.
So most Walmarts actually try to work with local farmers, or is each state different?
Each state's probably different depending on the buyer, but I know a lot of the Walmarts, I think state by state or region by region, they have different distribution managers that work a lot with local farmers.
Okay. Anyone looking out to next week? As meteorologists, we're always looking for the next storm system, and I know this is the time of year where, of course, the farmers got to get out in the field, and as you said, begin to harvest, so they don't want too much rainfall. But looking at projected outlooks here, next week looks pretty wet.
Yeah.
When you look at a long-range outlook, let's say 6 to 10 days out, even medium-range outlook, and you say, wow, the next 6 to 10 days look really, really wet, does that increase a farmer's, need to get out and harvest, or do they work day by day?
It's a little bit of both, but yeah, it will increase it if they see rain in the forecast, and they know that they've got crops that they need to get out. Wheat, for instance, is one where you just don't let wheat sit. You can't. It'll lose quality in the field, whereas corn can kind of hang out a little bit longer. Beans don't necessarily suffer as bad, aside from muddy fields or something like that. But the farmer lives on the 6 to 10 day. He really does. I remember when I was a kid, my uncle would call, because I grew up on a farm, and he would call and say, what's the extended forecast look like? What are we looking at for next Tuesday? And like I told you earlier, I wanted to be a meteorologist more than anything when I was a kid. So I watched the Weather Channel, nonstop. That's a normal thing for kids to do, right? But yeah, I could tell him what it was, and I still, to this day, I mean, the 6 to 10 and the 8 to 14 day forecast, you take them with a grain of salt, understandably so. And I have to explain to a lot of my farmers that the darker blue doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be that much colder. It just means you have an increased likelihood of below normal temperatures and things like that. But yeah, looking out, it looks a little wet. For me personally, using that from a seller standpoint, I'm not going to sell any early delivery grain, just because I don't think my guys are going to be able to get out and run it necessarily. So I'm not going to put the risk on myself that I'm going to commit to delivering bushels to an end user that I don't know will be there. So if I look out and see that we have above average or above normal, or a chance of above normal precipitation, I'm going to take a little time and see how the forecast develops before I dive in head first.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of that plays off of climatology, and of course, above normal for that time of year. And a lot of times when we do a weather blog and we'll say above normal rain chances, or above normal precip, I should be saying, in the month of January, completely different, September. And for Oklahoma, our top 3 wettest months are May, June, and September. Our rainy season actually was very interesting down here because it kind of started off slow. We got into a flash drought, as we like to call it, where quickly drought kind of came in, and then July happened, and July just it actually improved our our soil moisture quite a bit. The rain came, it just kept raining, it was cool. We briefly dropped down to D1 drought and even got out of drought in portions of Oklahoma County, surrounding Oklahoma City Metro. But out to the west and southwest, they have seen improvements, but whenever we run a drought story, we kind of focus on southwestern Oklahoma because it has been ongoing for a very long time. I mean, they're talking about lakes down there that are 10 to 15% capacity, and they're doing water conservation as well. We just started doing a weather forecast for an ag radio station that basically runs all the way across Oklahoma. Yeah. It bleeds a little bit into Kansas and into Arkansas. As we do our weather forecasts for these ag radio stations, what are the things that we need to talk about the most in our weather forecast when we give them? Because we have a time limit. We have about a minute and a half. I don't want to be giving information if it's not needy to the agriculture community. So, top 3 things that farmers care about most right now when it comes to weather. What are they?
Chance of rain. Probably your wind, and then your overall temperature, night temperature, dew point style thing. So you're all 3 on that, because your night temperature, if you get cool enough for us up here, night temperature will have a big influence on how much dew you have the next morning and what you're dealing with on that side of things, and how early you're able to get started, and just the moisture profile overall. But the biggest thing is the chance of rain and what could influence that. I think a lot of times guys take it at face value, maybe, that you say, okay, it's a 40% chance of rain, and they assume, all right, well, I have a 4 in 10 chance it's going to rain today. Well, that doesn't, kind of explain how a 40% chance may actually influence and how that could completely evaporate, or how it could actually pick up, and just what you're looking at from a pattern standpoint, I think would probably be a little helpful for these guys.
We had a what was I going to say? Oh, sorry.
No,
just thinking about something else. Okay, you mentioned wind.
Yeah.
What is it about wind or wind direction? I forgot. Did you say wind direction?
Well, both really, when it comes down to it, because throughout the production season you're going to have guys that need to do some application of chemicals or fertilizer or something of that nature, and if there's heavy wind, of course they're not going to be able to do that, because they want to do as much as they can to avoid drift and issues. Going back to what we were talking about earlier with conservation and things of that nature, they're going to make sure they aren't going out and spraying in 35, 40 mile an hour wind, which, of course, in the panhandle of Oklahoma, your wind versus Michigan wind are 2 very different things. I have a friend who, the wind's calm today, it's 25 miles an hour. I'm like, are you kidding me? How do you call that calm? But it will have a big influence on what they're doing and what they may plan for the day ahead.
It's funny you say that, because there'll be a lot of times when we get a storm report from a severe thunderstorm, or even a thunderstorm that comes on through, and they'll say, wind's about 50 miles per hour, and we're like, well, we get that on a sunny day out here.
That's a Tuesday. Yeah, that's why I crack up about it. But yeah, it's a Tuesday in Oklahoma, 50 mile an hour winds.
Absolutely. I've been talking now for about 25 minutes. Hey, Brad, Jonathan, you all have been sitting there. What are you dying to ask Angie today?
Well, good afternoon, Angie. Wanted to ask you, we've been talking a lot about weather and when it comes to the farming industry, and as we know, from Oklahoma to Michigan, you feed the world. The plains are the breadbasket of not just America, but the world as we know it. What in your opinion is the greatest threat, if there is one, facing our food supply, facing the crops?
There's a lot. I mean, that's the hard part, to pinpoint one of the greatest threats. Probably just it's difficult to say, but probably in a lot of ways an over-regulatory standpoint, to where the farmer is unable to make money. We're so concerned about stewardship of the land and things of that nature from an outside perspective, with folks who don't necessarily come in and work with the farmer day to day. So the biggest thing is to make sure that we don't bring in unintended consequences because one situation or another has developed this protocol or this idea or this approach to producing our food that may end up hurting 90% of the farmers out there purely because we were concerned about the 10%. So I think that's the one thing that we've really got to be aware of over-regulating or stepping in and crossing a lot of lines and limiting the farmer's ability to do what he or she knows how to do the best. So, and then of course global geopolitical uncertainty worldwide that's always in the back of our minds on what we've got going on there.
With the topics of this week, of course, yesterday President Obama spoke about climate change and some of the impacts and some of the initiatives of what some of the world's countries can do. From you dealing directly with the farming community, do farmers seem to be concerned about climate change, or is it just day-to-day weather for them, where they're just trying to get by right now? You know, climate's going to happen, weather's what you get. What is the consensus in the farming industry on the threat of climate change?
It's like society, there really isn't one. There's not a necessary consensus. There's some that will tell you, some guys that will definitely tell you in all honesty that there has been some changes, there has been some significant events that have developed. Most guys, I would say, though, will tell you that weather's cyclical, that their grandpa told them about the drought that we had. 2012 drought was similar to what we saw in the 30s and in the 50s. So we'd experienced it, we'd recovered from it, et cetera, et cetera. Temperature anomalies and precipitation anomalies like we saw this past winter, similar to 77, 78 here in Michigan. So a lot of guys are of the opinion where there is some change and there is some different things that are taking place. They do feel as though we want to make sure that we are stewards of the land and of our natural resources, but at the same time, they're looking at just weather being a cyclical thing. It's something they have to deal with. They are going to be aware of what they can do to help, conserve and do better for the earth, but at the same time, a lot of them will say, oh, that's nothing I can control. It gives them something to complain about most days, is what we joke about, the weather does, so.
And my last question before we see what Jonathan has on his brain, insects. Is there any concern about a new locust swarm like we had back in the what was it, the 20s?
The Dust Bowl there?
Yeah. Are there any bugs that are just showing up and you're like, we don't know how to kill these things? What are we going to do about this beetle? Are there any pests that are creating more of a problem these days?
Not necessarily. Not from a wide range. There are some, but we've grown. We learned from our mistakes throughout the Dust Bowl and things like that, where they came from. With the dry conditions and then the farrowed land, the land left unchanged. Gave them food sources and things like that. So there isn't anything that I'm aware of that is necessarily unkillable at this point in time or a big concern, but there's always a concern about pesticides. That's why you see the genetically modified traits, the increases and things like that, because there are certain varieties of corn that are made to fight off the pesticides without necessarily having to come out and spray chemicals and do the things that everyone expects farmers to do. There are ways that we have developed to where the corn's capable of fighting that off itself and things like that. But it is something that we watch constantly. Lots of people are paid big money to make sure that they're aware of any sort of migratory patterns or anything like that from an insect standpoint. And there's always a concern when it gets really dry about grasshoppers and locusts and things like that. This past winter being so cold was actually a benefit. The freezing of the soil and things like that was helpful in killing off some of the larvae that we'd had. So there were different things that had happened that, similar to weather, it's so cyclical where you may see an increase in population and then suddenly the next year you don't deal with it at all. But it is something that people watch very, very closely and make sure they're monitoring it.
Good deal. Actually, it's interesting. I was just tweeting out something that you were saying, and you mentioned pesticides. And pesticides seems to be the one word that you hear if you walk into Whole Foods or any of these stores, and they, we don't want any pesticides on our food. Are pesticides as bad as some doctors on TV shows will come out and say, "Oh, pesticides! You shouldn't be eating this," or is it just? Are they really okay for us?
Well, I don't want to say they're okay for us and get a boatload of hate mail. They need to be used as with anything else. You know, the one thing that you're seeing right now from a herbicide standpoint, the 2,4-D yesterday was the big one. There's a lot of false information that's put out about that. You know, basically a misunderstanding perhaps of what's used where. You always want to make sure you wash your fruits and vegetables and things of that nature, but when it comes down to it, like with soybeans, there are certain time periods that you cannot spray. So if once your soybean plant's potted, once it's actually put on the food, the soybean itself, you're not spraying. The farmer's not going out and doing anything to damage that. Very similar with corn once it puts an ear on. There may be certain things where they use fungicide, you know, to help combat mold and other fungus-related issues. But for the most part, if a lot of folks were to look at it and realize the bulk of pesticide use in corn and soybeans, now it may be a different scenario in fruit and vegetables and things like that, but the bulk of pesticide use in corn and soybeans is done before the crop's even close to producing the product that we're going to use. So the residual effect of pesticides, herbicides, fungicides on the corn and soybeans that make it into the marketplace is relatively non-existent. And there's a lot of significant monitoring that takes place and is involved in that. We've got a non-GMO bean program. A lot of folks will confuse non-GMO with organic. We use chemicals on the non-GMO beans, but we keep track of what's used, what's sprayed, how it's used, when the farmer uses it, everything of that nature. And it's really one of those things where it's very, very closely monitored. And a lot of folks think we're just willy-nilly going out. No, the expense of it, the safety behind it, everything of that sense is really used heavily, and we make sure we're not just going out. I mean, for me, no, you're not going to drink it by the gallon, but from an overall standpoint, the risk of living your life is relatively low when it comes to that.
Okay. Jonathan, what do you have?
I have 3 questions, Angie. Jonathan here
Hi.
from the KOCO Weather Helm is what we call it.
I feel like I'm there. It's awesome. I feel like
it's
it's the closest I'll ever come.
So here are my 3 questions, and they're a little bit off topic.
Well, that's fair.
What are your thoughts on urban sprawl overtaking cropland? Here's the background.
Yeah.
I've lived in Oklahoma City a while, and where I live right now, I live in a small community outside of Oklahoma City. It's an agricultural community. I drive through wheat fields and cattle fields every day, and I notice that, oh, a neighborhood is going up here. A neighborhood is going up here. Are we going to reach a point? Now, obviously, I've driven across Kansas, and we don't have a problem there.
No.
But when are we going to get to a point where we're running out of cropland? Is that an issue?
It can be an issue. It definitely could be something. We always joke, you know, money talks. So what we've seen with the recent downturn in the housing market, of course, over the last few years has been a slowdown in what you're seeing from an urban sprawl standpoint, but it's still happening. I had a big customer who sold several hundred acres recently to a casino and another related developmental project right there. So that's going to be a big difference. And it'll all come down, you know, recently with the high grain prices and the high return on investment when it came to farming, the idea of coming in and scooping up farmland to turn it into residential or agriculture, commercial use, excuse me, has kind of stopped. Now, though, with the price of crops falling off and things of that nature, there is the potential there that you could see some folks convert that land that they were farming back into something else. So it's always going to be this touch and go. Everyone wants to have space, but they want to be close to things. You know, you want to live in the country, but you want to be 5 miles away from the local convenience store if you forget milk at dinner time. So it's always going to be this constant battle. But like you said, there's certain areas that it's something you won't necessarily have to worry about. I was on a crop tour this summer from South Dakota through Nebraska into Iowa up into Minnesota, and there's a lot of areas around there that I mean, it'll take a lot of urban sprawl to get those issues to develop. But it is something we need to be aware of, and something that as we have to feed more people, we make sure that we don't take away that ground that allows us to do so.
Okay, question number 2, the future of farming.
I think it's great.
Well, you know, let me expand my question.
Mm-hmm.
I've seen it, the kids coming out, okay, so the kids coming out these days don't have the work ethic that my father taught me. So what's the current state of the farming families? Are kids, are they taking on their father's farm, and do they have a strong work ethic, or are they going, man, farming's hard.
I don't want to
wanna
do
work.
that. Yeah, it's the farming families seem to be okay. The farm kids coming up, I mean, they've grown up on it. Probably 2 out of 3 farm kids are going to do what they can to stay on the farm and work, where the one will probably go off and do his own thing and then maybe come back eventually. That is the struggle that we have in agriculture in general, is the workforce. I personally, we're running a business here with almost 60 employees. To find the guys to come in and that are willing to work the extra hours and go the extra mile in order to help handle food are very difficult to find. So it is going to be very situational. It's difficult. Farming is a lot of hard work and low pay. So to convince these guys to come in, and over the past few years, you've been able to keep kids on the farm because the revenue's been there. Prices have been up. The farm has been solidly in the black, and things have been good. It'll be interesting to see if we see something similar to what we saw in the 80s, where you did see throughout the 80s and the 90s an exodus of generations leaving the farm because they were unable to support families. Where you had the mom and the dad. Well, the kids couldn't necessarily farm with mom and dad because they couldn't bring in enough money to make sure that they were feeding their kids and working on the farm and able to do a lot of that. So we're going to see some changes over the next few years on who's doing what as prices drop and we run into some interesting money type situations. But we'll always struggle with finding folks that want to come in and work hard and do the dirty work with half the pay is what some other jobs are, but from an overall standpoint, we should be okay.
Third question.
Yes.
Hard question.
Okay.
You have a huge audience right now of weather enthusiasts that are going to watch this podcast, or forecasters and meteorologists.
Yeah.
Explain as quickly as you can, how can we put our forecasting skills in plain commodities? So for example, if I can forecast out about maybe 2 weeks, how can I day trade and make a lot of money?
Well, if you know that it's going to be hot and dry in July, you want to buy corn because it's going to impact pollination. If you know it's going to be hot and dry in August, you want to buy soybeans because it's going to impact pod fill. So you just want to figure out, what you can do when the critical production periods are for grain. Hot and dry during harvest isn't bad. If it's wet and cold during harvest, that's going to be positive for grain prices. So it's one of those things where right now, like we said earlier, 2 weeks out, it looks like we're going to be dealing with above normal precipitation. Right now, to me, I'm not selling any extra grain because I think it's going to be difficult for me to source it. So there's going to be certain time periods where if it's too wet, too cold during planting, April-May time frame, that's going to be bullish or positive to price. It's going to move the markets higher. If it's hot and dry in July and August, then that's going to be, of course, bullish to price because you're going to be reducing production from that standpoint. And again, if it's cold and wet during harvest. So we basically want it warm and dry during planting and harvest and somewhat cool and wet during July and August. And if it's the opposite of that, then you want to be looking at buying some grains.
Thank you.
I feel like we all should probably go pitch in some money. Hey,
Yeah.
Angie, we're running up on time here, but of course, very end of the show, I always like to open up to you. Anything you want to plug, advertise, get your name out?
I'm not really an advertiser. I'm just one of those where if I can help anyone, be an ambassador of the industry to folks who may not necessarily work in it, and then I like to work with my customers on how to handle the markets when they do. So pretty much I'm just the smart aleck on Twitter that'll kind of inform you a little bit about the grain markets and post funny pictures every now and again. That's about the gist.
And what's your Twitter handle again for everyone out there watching?
It's the Goddess of Grain, which I have to explain is tongue-in-cheek. It's not one of those things where I was like, well, I'm definitely a goddess. We always joke I handle 12 million bushel here, and to put it in perspective, there are about 1,500 bushels on a load of grain. So 12 million bushels, I'll let you do the math. So we always joke that I'm the queen of crisis and the goddess of grain. So that's where we went with the goddess of grain, and that's kind of taken on a life of its own. That is one thing I never expected through Twitter, was that the goddess of grain would become a character of some sort, I think. So.
I like it. I like it. Well, Angie, you did a great job today, and we're going to have to reconnect with you back in the future next season, see what's happening as we go into the springtime. But our time is running out. It's time for lunch, time for me to go to work. But thank you so much for coming on our show, and we'll be talking again soon.
Oh, thanks for having me. I had a blast.